In this video, I'm going to run through how you can secure external data using Outseta with Webflow. So for this example, I've put together a small demo where a user can log in with their Outseta account, they can create notes, and then they can view their previously created notes. So let's log in and run through it. If I click the login, I'll see the native Outseta login modal. I'll log in. And now we can see we've got two notes. So we've got my first note, and if we take a look at it, we can see the title and the content. And then we've got my second note. Again, we can see the title and the content. Now, we can also search and filter. This is using front-end filtering, like so. And we can create a note. So let's create my third note. Let's just enter hello world and save it. And now we can see that item has been appended to the list, and if we click view, we can see the note. Now all of this data is being stored in Airtable. So let's head over to Airtable and take a quick look. So we've got two tables. We've got users and we've got notes. In our users table, we've got two users, and the first one is the one we're using for this example. So we've got the email, we've got the Outseta ID for the user, and then we've got the notes. If we take a look at the notes table, here we've got the title of the note, the content, the user it's assigned to. So we can see these are the three linked to the user we're testing with. And then we've got a lookup, so we've got access to the owner of the notes Outseta ID. We can see these three are different from these two. So when this page is loaded, a request is being made to Alphi, which is our no-code backend, which then includes the user's token, which is provided by Outseta using their JavaScript library. We can then validate that server side to make sure the token is valid, it hasn't been manipulated, the user has a valid account. And that allows us to know that one, the user has an account, and two, who the user is. So who is the user making this request? And this means that we can then use the user ID from the token once it's been verified to then filter the records when making a query to Airtable to only return the records for that user. So let's run through this in Alphi because it'll be a bit easier to explain with our visual interface. So here we've got our flow. If we start off with the start node, we can see the method is get, as we're going to be getting data. This is the endpoint that's called when the page is loaded. And there's no parameters configured. Next, we've got the Outseta node, and this is the node that does all of the magic behind the scenes to validate the access token, check that it's valid, hasn't been manipulated, hasn't expired, check that the issuer and the audience are also valid. And then once it's gone through all of those checks, the data inside of the token is made accessible within your flow. And this is one of the great things about Outseta. They include some just really valuable data when you're creating flows. So for example, we've got the ID of the user, we've got the email, we've got the first name, last name, which I haven't populated as this is a demo account. We've got the account ID. So in Outseta, you can have an account and then users inside of the account. We've got a unique identifier, and you can configure that in Outseta for each user. Say you've got your own internal CRM and you want to use the same ID. We can check if the account is the primary account, which effectively means are they the owner of the account? They're not like a user that's been invited to the account. Then we've got the subscription ID and the plan ID. Now these last two, these are especially useful and we see users using these frequently. So say you're creating a flow and you only want users to be able to create a certain number of notes based on their plan. So just as an example, let's say if you're on the starter plan, you can create 50 notes. If you're on the pro plan, you can create 100 notes. Using other no-code membership tools, it's not possible to identify the plan of a user without making another call to get their plan from their admin API. Using Outseta, we've got the IDs without making any API calls. So you could check, is the plan ID equal to the like plan? If it is, check how many they've made, and then if they've gone over the limit, restrict them. And you can do a similar thing with the subscription. So this is one of my favorite features in Outseta. And yeah, if you're building a complex app, it can save you at least one API call for every flow where you're checking the plan or subscription. So yeah, that's great. Now, you may be wondering, okay, how do I configure this? Like, what do I need to do to get this working in Alphi? So you may have seen, unlike the other nodes in Alphi, the authorization nodes don't have any node configuration. So this is just empty. And this is because you manage the authorization nodes in the global settings. So you can either click this link here, or in the left side panel, you can click this cog icon. And here you'll see the allowed hosts and the Outseta ID. So this is where you'll want to paste your Outseta ID. And you can find your Outseta ID by going to Settings and General. And then here in the Outseta URL, you'll see the value that we're looking for. So you can copy this, head over to Alphi, paste it in here. And then once we've got that, we'll be able to perform all the validation on all the checks server side to ensure the user has an account, and to identify who they are. So once that step's done, we can then use that data in the flow. But before we do that, I just want to touch on what's included in the request. So when you add an authorization node like Outseta, even though we had no parameters configured in our start node, if we go to run it, you'll see that there is a token field that's required. And for anyone who's not familiar with Alphi, when you're running it inside of the flow, this is really just for testing, but this is the easiest way for me to illustrate this. So even though no input parameters have been configured, which you would normally see here, we do have an input field. And this is because we need the access token in order to perform the validation. So if we click run without entering anything, we get a 400 bad request, authorization token not provided. If we enter a value, it errors again, we get a 401 unauthorized. So if the token can't be validated and the authorization fails, then there's no way the user can get to the rest of the flow. So no other records are going to be filtered. It's not like we do anything crazy like fetching all of the Airtable records and then filtering them in Alphi. Like if you don't get past the authorization check, then the flow is just halted and an error is returned to the browser. In this example, we've got the step as the first one after the start node, but we have seen examples where users use it later in the flow. So for example, you may want to have a flow where sometimes no authorization is required, and then other instances it is. So you can do that. You can move this, say, and have it after a logic block. But for this example, we've kept it here, and generally we recommend it as the first node. So then if the authorization fails, the whole flow fails. So you may be wondering, what on earth is this token and how do I get it? So I'm just going to jump into the Alphi docs, and under Authentication, you'll see Outseta. And here we've got the configuration, which we just mentioned. And then we've got the accessing the user data. We've got the properties that we just covered, so you can see those here and how you can access them. Then right at the bottom, we've got the user token. So to access the token, you can use the Outseta library, which you will have added to your Webflow project. And if you do outseta.getAccessToken, that will return the access token. So I'm just going to jump into Webflow and show you the code for this here. So this is the function where we get the notes. This is our fetch query. You can see we pass in our Alphi URL. It's a get method. And then in the headers, we're including the authorization header, which includes the bearer token. So we prefix the value with bearer. And then here we're doing outseta.getAccessToken. So this is how we get access to the token. Like, it should be included like this in the request. So let's refresh this page again, just so this error goes. Let's go to production. So there's no execution path, so let's just refresh this page and we can see it runs. So if we take a look at the start node, go to the headers, here you can see the token. So it's being included in the request, and we automatically know where to look for it because this node is included in the flow. And then, as I mentioned, we verify it, perform all the checks, and then if they're passed, we continue the flow. So next question we get a lot is, okay, but what if I haven't configured the Webflow side yet and I just want to test it within Alphi? So if you want to get the access token, you can go to your site, right click, inspect the page, go to the console, and then if you run outseta.getAccessToken and press enter, here you'll see the access token. For anyone who's thinking they can mess around with my account, I will be deleting this user after this demo. And that's an important note actually. Your access token is effectively a password, so you should never share it with anyone. Like anyone. So yeah, I'm showing them in this example. You should never include them in a video or demonstration unless you know what you're doing and you're going to delete that user afterwards. So let's copy that, head back over to Alfie, paste our token and click run. You can see we went through the authorization check. Next, we've got the Airtable node. So we've set our connection, we've selected our base, and then we've selected the table within the base that we would like to list our records from. And then here we're using filters. So we're filtering by the Outseta ID column where it equals request.user.id. And request.user is a special variable which we populate when you're using a node like the Outseta node. So this can't be populated from the front end. That's an important thing to mention actually. You should never be sending a user ID from the front end in a hidden field or anything like that, or the user's email in a hidden field and then using that to perform your authorization check. That's the whole point. We've added this Outseta node. You include the authorization token, then we validate it to get the ID. If you just include the ID, other users will be able to spoof it. They'll be able to override data in your database, potentially delete users, and just perform havoc. So yes, this cannot be populated from the front end. This is populated server side at runtime if the authorization check passed. So let's take a look at the response. So we've got 3 records, and these are our notes. So let me expand this a little bit. So we've got my first note, my second note, and my third note. So again, if we jump into Airtable, the reason we've only got these 3 is because we were filtering by this Outseta ID column, where the ID equals the user ID, which was taken from the token, which went through the validation checks. And if you've seen some of our previous videos, you know Airtable returned the data in this format, so the ID, creator time, then a fields object with the columns inside of it. We then perform a logic check to check if that request was successful, so if the status code was 200. If it was, we do some formatting just to kind of flatten the data and make it easier to work with on the front end. So the end result, we have 3 notes: the ID, the creator time, title, content, the user, and this is the Airtable ID for the user. We use this demo for MemberStack as well, so that's why that's there. And then we've got the Outseta ID. So that is how you can securely fetch records from Airtable associated to the logged in Outseta user. So now we've done that, let's touch on creating a note. So again, I've got a flow here. Just like the getting the notes inside of the code, we are including the Outseta ID in the request, in the authorization header, but there are some differences with this flow. First things off, we have, this is a post request. We're going to be creating records in Airtable, or creating a record in Airtable. You never want to use get if you're modifying your data source. Next, there's 2 body parameters. So we've got the title and the content. So again, we're not including the ID of the user we're creating the record for. We're just going to include the title and the content. Next, we've got our Outseta node, which will then give us access to the ID of the user. Bearing in mind, this is the Outseta ID for the user. This isn't the Airtable ID for the user. And I mention that because we will need the Airtable record ID for the user in our users table, because that is how Airtable allows us to link the note being created to the user. So if we were to pass the Outseta ID in this user field, Airtable would error because Airtable has no idea what Outseta is. It doesn't relate to our users table. Even though it's in there, you can't create a reference using it. So the first thing we need to do after we've gone through the authorization checks and passed is we need to get the user. So here we're using list records. We are setting our base, which is the notes, the table, which is users. I've set max records as 1 just to make it a bit more performant. There should only ever be 1 user for each user ID, obviously, as well. And then here we are filtering the users where the Outseta ID equals request.userid, kind of just like we did when we were fetching our notes, but this time this is on the users table. And this returns the user record. And within the user record, we now have access to the ID for the record for our user within Airtable. Then we've got a logic check. Just like before, we check if the status code is 200, but we also have an additional step this time. We're checking if the length of the data returned is greater than 0. So as we're using list records here, Airtable will return a list of records. As I mentioned, we only expect, or there should only ever be 1 record for each Outseta user ID, unless you've manually made a mistake in your Airtable base or something like that. But there should only be 1. If none are returned, then it means that Outseta ID is not linked to anyone in your Airtable base. So we want to check for that. So here we're doing nodes.getUser.data. We're then using the length expression. So we're piping it to the length to get the length of the data, which was an array. If it's greater than 0, excellent, we'll continue. If it's not, then we throw an error, and you could display a message like this user is not associated or not configured in Airtable. So say, to add some context here, say you've got an automation where when someone signs up to Outseta, you also add their record in Airtable. So here, because again, you need to have a record corresponding to the user in Outseta, so then you can link the records. You could arguably just have the Outseta ID on the notes, but from our experience with users who do that, it just becomes a bit hard to manage because then you've just got all of these IDs. We recommend setting up an automation so then you've got like a mirror of your Outseta users in Airtable, and then you can expand their user profiles, etc. But sticking with the topic here of creating the note, at this point we know the user is logged in, we know who they are, we have got the user record associated to them in Airtable, and like we know it exists. So the next step is to create the record. So this time the base ID is notes and the table is notes, and we are going to be creating a record. In case you're wondering why all of these nodes say read only, this is because we're in production at the moment. So you can see here we're in production and you can't make changes to a production flow, but it's good for me to demonstrate because this actually runs as I'm refreshing the page and doing things on the demo. So the base is notes, the table is notes, and then in Alphi we give you this list of fields, and then we've just mapped the data that we've configured as body data. So in the start node that I mentioned at the beginning of this flow, we're mapping request.body.title to the title, request.body.content to the content, and then the user, unlike before where we were doing request.user.id, this time we're doing nodes.getUser.data.o.id. We know there will always be a record in there as we had our logic check, and this is going to be the Airtable record ID for our user, and that allows Airtable to create that reference. Next, we check if that request was successful, so if the status code was 200, and then here we're flattening and formatting the data so it appears like this. So just like when we were fetching the notes, this is an array, but inside of it we've got ID, created time, title, content, user, Outseta ID. This time again, ID, created time, title, content, user, Outseta ID. The reason we recommend having the same data structure when you're creating a record as when you're fetching a record is when we create a note, let's do another one, test 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, you'll see that the note is added into the UI. There's no page refresh. We're not making another API call to fetch all of them after we've added the note. What we're actually doing is using our JavaScript framework, framework here. When we create a note, if it was successful, so here, this gets run, we're simply pushing the response into our reactive store, into the notes array, and that just automatically renders it on the page, displays the data, and it's just super simple. We're not making more API calls, we're not having to like format things or make changes in JavaScript. We're just taking that response and pushing it into notes. If you're not familiar with our JavaScript framework, it's a reactive framework built specifically for Webflow, and it allows you to build things like this with minimal JavaScript. So this whole little demo is 119 lines of code with comments. We have our reactive store here. So we're storing notes, the filtered notes, whether the notes are loading, the query for the search input. Then we've got the create form, the edit form. Is it loading? So we can actually get rid of this one now. Is it loading? Is it saving? displaying the create modal, displaying the edit modal. We mount the component, and then we've got a couple of functions for like viewing the note, filtering the notes, resetting the filters, and then 2 functions for our API calls. So really easy. You just use attributes to like set what's showing, what isn't showing, and then it's all reactive. So that's a quick rundown on what we built. If you've got any questions, feel free to reach out. I don't think we're going to be able to make this clonable, because unlike some of the other ones we've released, this uses some premium Reloom components, like the table. So I don't feel comfortable releasing this as a clonable. Huge shout out to Reloom. They make it so easy to iterate and develop and put demos together like this. So I recommend taking a look at Outseta if you're looking to repeat this. If you've already got on a Reloom account, hop on a Zoom call with me, prove you've got it, and then I'll be more than happy to clone this project and transfer it over to you. But yeah, any questions, feel free to reach out.